Hello, welcome. We are so glad you are able to join us for this Tuesday afternoon program, or whatever time it is where you are. Thank you for joining us today. Today's speaker is our very own Logan Knight. He is our newest genealogy librarian from Henderson, Kentucky. So we are very excited to have him speak on this. He is going to entertain us and give us a lot of great information. So Logan, would you like to take it away by sharing your screen?
Thank you so much, Allison. I really do appreciate that. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you fine folks out there for making time on your busy schedule to attend today's program. I hope that we're all going to learn some stuff together and maybe even have a little bit of fun along the way. So the title of this particular program is Mein Feld ist die Welt, Hamburg Passenger Lists, 1850 to 1934. This is a collection of, well, as the title says, passenger lists of people departing for the New World from the German port of Hamburg. I'm going to explain as we go on why these are so important and some of the uses you can put to researching your family history. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. This famous poem, The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus, conjures up images of ships full of immigrants streaming into the harbor at Ellis Island under Lady Liberty's welcoming gaze. Movies and television have imprinted this sort of scene onto the American popular imagination. Yet this is only part of the story. These ships did not appear spontaneously out of the fog. They had to have a departure point. And for many immigrants, their final sight of the old world of Europe would have been the specially built docks at Cuxhaven, several miles up the river from the great port city of Hamburg. Now that's all well and good, but what's so important about Hamburg passenger lists? After all, it's not like Europe lacks any ports, so why focus on just one? The answer is fairly simple. A very large proportion of immigrants to the United States left through Hamburg. Between the years 1850 and 1934, roughly 5 million people immigrated from this single port. If your ancestors came from Central or Eastern Europe, there is an excellent chance they departed from Hamburg. In the time before visas, these passenger lists are some of the only records concerning immigration that are widely available. Even better, Hamburg maintained excellent documents concerning immigrants. These records are almost complete from the years 1850 through 1934. In comparison, Great Britain did not require any kind of records for immigrants until 1890, and not for foreigners passing through the country until 1923, long after the major waves of immigration had left Europe. Records from other major immigration ports, such as Bremen, have largely been destroyed, either through war or just pitching them into the trash. So these Hamburg lists are probably the most complete collection of passenger lists existing in the world, as well as covering an incredibly long time period as well. Now, to understand the immigrant experience and Hamburg's unique role in their journey, we need to understand the history of the city and what led it to become an embarkation point for so many people. Now, people have occupied the area around Hamburg in what is today roughly northwestern Germany for thousands of years. But the area really begins to assume importance around 808 AD, when the famous Emperor Charlemagne ordered fortifications built there to help prevent Viking and Slavic raids. The city would endure many ups and downs over the years, but truly began to come into its own when Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa granted the city a charter. This charter contained many rights for the city, the most important of which was granting the city's freedom from any feudal lord except the emperor himself. This, in fact, turned Hamburg into basically a city-state, much in the way that ancient Athens or Sparta was. This independence would allow Hamburg to grow as the years went on. Now, Hamburg owes everything to the Elbe River. This river runs 680 miles from northern Czechia through Germany, where it flows into the North Sea. The city is located about 60 miles upstream, perfectly situated for trade and travelers coming back and forth. This particular image that you'll see is the city's seal that is still used to this day. Now, as the Middle Ages came, Hamburg joined together with other city-states, including Bremen and Lübeck, founding the famous Hanseatic League. This league of cities, all around the Baltic, joined together in a loose alliance for mutual protection and trading privileges. This league had trading posts called contours that largely functioned almost as independent cities within cities and were included in larger metropolises such as London, all the way to Novgorod. At its height, the League could wage war with kings and dominated trade in the Baltic and North Seas. Yet, as time went on, the League declined as centralized nation-states began to emerge around it. In this increasingly dangerous environment, Hamburg attempted to keep its head down as much as possible during the various conflicts that raged throughout Europe. The city, run by its Senate, largely staffed by lawyers and merchants, tried to focus on trade and other economic activities, in which they were quite successful. By the end of the 19th century, Hamburg would be the biggest port on the European continent, and behind only London, Liverpool, and New York in the world. Somewhat surprisingly, the city was a relative latecomer to the business of immigration. The citizens of Hamburg feared that immigrants would bring disease or would fall into poverty and become an economic burden on the townspeople. In fact, as late as 1832, Hamburg would pass laws against large groups of immigrants coming to the city. This meant, of course, that immigrants often did not come to Hamburg. To put this into context, from 1841 to 1846, roughly 115,000 people immigrate through Bremen, while only 11,000 do so through Hamburg. Even worse, the city had a terrible reputation for swindlers and poor accommodations. In fact, it was the sister city of Hamburg, Bremen, that pioneered large-scale immigration through Germany. Bremen passed a series of laws in 1832 that required a certain amount of passenger space, decent food and water, and seaworthiness among ships that took on immigrants. These seem fairly standard now, but were revolutionary for the time. Bremen's economy benefited enormously as immigrants chose that city for their departure. Between the years 1830 and 1975, 7 million immigrants would leave from there, roughly 50% German and 50% Eastern European, all told. Hamburg watched all of this with greedy eyes and decided to get in on the act. It started passing laws based on the Bremen model and correspondingly saw a rise in immigrants. Most importantly for us, these laws included keeping passenger lists, which is why we have them today. Statistics were kept by 1837, but we only have from 1850 onwards. By 1855, the immigrant numbers had gotten big enough that the city established an official government department to oversee them, the Auspandora Holland, also known as the Immigrant Authority. In 1847, the Hamburg Amerikanische Paketfahrt Gesellschaft, or Hauppauge, as I will now be calling it, became the first regular transatlantic shipping line between Hamburg and the New World. Its name will later be shortened to simply the Hamburg America line. People joked at the time that Hauppauge stood for Haben alle Passagiere auch Geld, which roughly translates to, do all the passengers have money? Which should give you an idea of what the firm was all about. Now, Hauppauge was not the only passenger shipping line based in Hamburg, but it was by far the biggest. And in fact, the majority of these records we are going to be looking at later in the presentation were generated by this company. Now, the rise of Hauppauge and Hamburg's status as the premier immigration port on the continent is really the story of one man, Albert Bellin. Bellin was born August 15th, 1857, the 13th son of a Jewish Dane who ran a middling immigration agency in the city. Albert would take over the family business and made it a huge success. This success caught the eyes of the directors of Hauppauge, who hired him in 1888 and made him board chairman in 1899. He would live up to his motto, Mein Feld ist die Welt, which correctly translated means the world is my field, but more accurately titled, the world is my domain. This would become Hauppauge's slogan and would be pretty much plastered everywhere the company went, from ships to its buildings to advertisements, and is to this day probably one of the most well-known phrases associated with the steamship company. And what an incredibly accurate statement it would turn out to be. During these years, Bellin introduced radical technological changes that greatly benefited the steamship line. He introduced larger and larger ships. The company pioneered the use of double screw propellers, reducing the transit time considerably, and still in use today. Albert was a master businessman and constantly expanded the company, often buying rivals or dividing up market share with them in a somewhat vaguely legal monopoly. By the end of the 19th century, Hamburg America had become the largest shipping line in the world, with over 175 ships afloat, making regular runs to 5 continents. Albert even invented the idea of the cruise ship when, on January 2nd, 1891, the SS Augusta Victoria would start a 6-week cruise of the Mediterranean Sea. So if anyone out there has taken a Disney or Carnival cruise, please tip your cap to the man who came up with the idea in the first place. This success would ensure that Albert Bellin would become one of the most important men in Germany. He often held the Kaiser's ear, who made even the fairly rare sacrifice of meeting this non-noble Jewish person in his own home. That being said, because he was Jewish, he would always suffer prejudice, even if he had assimilated as much as possible. In fact, the SS Augusta Victoria, the ship that made the very first cruise, was named for the Kaiser's wife, who would not allow Jewish people in her household. Now, on the marketing side, the company expanded the use of ticketing agents, with 3,000 in America alone. They also had many part-time agents throughout Central and Eastern Europe who sold tickets on the side. These were often local community leaders who would be much more trusted than an official salesman. Now, we don't have extremely accurate numbers on these people because they kept a very low profile. Because for many years, immigration was illegal in both the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires. Now, later on, immigration would become legal, but even so, authorities would often harass those attempting to leave. All of this financial success was put in jeopardy by an outbreak of cholera in 1892. By the time it had run its course, close to 10,000 people in Hamburg had died. Ugly rumors quickly spread that it had been brought to the city by Russian immigrants. Hamburg's Senate immediately forbade any more immigrants from coming into the city between 1892 and 1893. Now, this threatened Hamburg, America with complete ruin, as its entire business model was based off of large-scale immigration. Bellin was able to get the ban lifted in 1893 by threatening to move the company to Bremen. Nevertheless, massive new procedures were adopted to avoid a repeat outbreak. So Hamburg, America, and the Bremen-based rival Norddeutscher Lloyd paid to set a series of medical inspection posts for immigrants in the eastern corners of Germany's empire for those people coming from Austria-Hungary and the Russian empires, to carefully examine all immigrants. This included invasive medical examinations of men, women, and children to ensure they were free from disease, to avoid another outbreak, such as the one that had affected Germany so terribly in 1892. The German authorities also decreed that each adult must have at least 400 marks in their possession. This was way too much money for almost all of the immigrants coming, but a substitution would be made if they had a steamship ticket from a German company. So a nice little bit of big business collaborating with politics here. The competition between the various lines could be fierce. Many of them, particularly between the German and British companies, had very strong nationalist issues attached to them. Many cases, they would start rumors about the others through their ticketing agents. And in many ways, it could be a very ugly thing, lying about, which port to take and all these sorts of things. And I will say, you can also see mein Feld SD Welt on board the Imperator, one of the major ships of Hamburg, America, that made many journeys between that city and New York. So the first part of any journey was getting to Hamburg proper. European railroad networks made this step much easier than in years past, and by the turn of the century, railroads were running trains with special immigrant-only cars. In fact, steamship lines and railroads had collaborated to the point where you could buy a combination ticket for both the railway journey and your steam ride to America. Now, on arrival in Hamburg, initially the immigrants were housed wherever they could find room. The sheer number of people overwhelmed the limited temporary housing, and so in 1900, a unique solution was created. This was the famous Auspandora Holland, which basically means immigrants' halls, a small town set up on the island of Welt in the middle of the city of Hamburg. At its height, it could accommodate 5,000 people at a time. The complex featured barbers, snack shops, post offices, a police station, and 2 luxury hotels for the more affluent, Hotel Sud and Hotel Nord. There was a library, and musical concerts were given every single day. Roughly 115 people staffed the complex, and food was often available at cost. A key factor in Hauppauge's success was its catering to Jewish passengers from Eastern Europe. Over 1 million Jewish people set sail from Hamburg to the New World. Hamburg, America made sure to court Jewish people. And the ways they did this was by simply taking into account their needs and wants and trying to supply them in a way that most other companies simply had no interest in. So, for example, the Auspandora Holland featured a kosher kitchen inspected by the chief rabbi of Hamburg and a very large synagogue, as well as a large Catholic church and a much smaller Protestant church, which shows the relative numbers of the immigrants involved here. Now, all of these immigrant groups were assisted by various religious groups within the city and in the larger world, and they helped with money, translation, religious comfort, and of course, just the 1.5 million technical details that went into immigrating. Now, while all of these accommodations were a tremendous improvement over what had gone before, there were inconveniences. The barracks were Spartan and military-like in organization, requiring passengers to line up for medical inspection. These medical inspections would usually involve some pretty intense fumigation, cropping the hair. Women would have their hair gone through with metal combs. It's very invasive, and for many people, it could be very humiliating. In particular, immigrants from the Russian Empire were not allowed to leave the island of Vettel due to lingering fears of contagion. This was pretty much always resented, but they had no choice in the matter. It should be noted that one of the biggest reasons why the steamship company in this case is attempting to do so many medical inspections is not only to spare Hamburg and the rest of Germany further outbreaks from disease, but also because the United States had passed a law saying that any contagious passenger would be turned away and the steamship company would be responsible for the cost of the return voyage. So, of course, they weren't taking any chances. The eye disease trachoma was actually by far the most common reason for rejection. All of this massive immigration came crashing down with the outbreak of the First World War. As the battle lines were drawn across Europe, fewer and fewer people were able to immigrate. For Hamburg, America, the war was an absolute disaster. Many of its ships were sunk, captured, or claimed as prizes by the victorious Allies. The end of the era was capped by Albert Bellin's death either by overdose or possible suicide, as we're still not sure what actually happened. Immigration would pick up after the war, but of course, the door would be quickly shut in the early 1920s by the famous Quota Acts that ensured that large numbers of Eastern and Southern Europeans could no longer come to the United States. On the other end, the newly independent countries of Central and Eastern Europe also enacted anti-immigrant policies to ensure that they would have enough people to try to build these newly independent states. For all intents and purposes, this ended Hamburg's current role as a center of immigration. Hauppauge would eventually combine with its rival Norddeutscher Lloyd and is still a going concern today, but not as a passenger fleet. All right, so with all of that background information, now we're going to take a look at the passenger lists themselves and just get an idea of what we're looking at here. So the handwritten indexes, these are covering slightly different years than what you'll see for the majority of them in the regular set. And how you search those is you go over here to browse this collection. You can choose a year. You can see kind of roughly what they cover. So I'm just going to take a look at 1890 to 1904. Band just means book, and you can see here the various dates involved. So we'll just do band 42. You check the surname letter. The index lists all passengers alphabetically by the first letter of the surname. But please understand they are in alphabetical order by last name and nothing else. So the surnames are alphabetical, but the first names are not necessarily. So as you can imagine, that can create some pretty intense confusion. So you will have to work your way through them. Also, the company would assign a certain number of pages per name. If they run out of space, the names would be continued in the back pages of other letters. So once again, a bit of a needle in a haystack, but we take what we can get. And of course, so some of you are also going to notice here that there's two different things off to the side here, direct and indirect. So what does that mean? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Just like with today's airline system, you have direct passengers, those who go straight from point A to point B, and indirect passengers who would have a layover somewhere else and take a different ship. These changeovers were usually through Great Britain, although you will find occasional trips to Dutch, Belgian, or French ports. Now, why would people do this? Well, just like today, the issue is often one of cost. Many of the British ports, particularly Liverpool and Southampton, ran more ships to North America than Hamburg or Bremen did at the time. So it was often quite a bit cheaper than just taking the direct line for Hamburg. However, then as today, you get what you pay for. Unlike Hamburg, the British government did not have many regulations regarding those ships. So instead of a certain amount of space guaranteed, food of a certain quality, those things are not there. So while you're going to get there quicker, it is going to be a more miserable experience. From 1870 to 1892, 1/3 or more of the passengers traveled via the indirect route. But later this declined to about 4% as the direct passage got more affordable. So they kept two separate lists until 1910, at which point they did away with it all because the vast majority of people are now traveling direct. And if you go through them, the indirect passenger lists, you can see it as time goes on, fewer and fewer and fewer people are doing it. Now, one key thing to remember too is that when we're looking through these passenger lists, people may be listed as an ethnicity or a nationality that they are not or would not have considered themselves. For example, many Poles would be listed as Austrian or Russian because they lived in those empires. Usually, however, you can use context clues, including the surnames and locations, are usually dead giveaways when it comes to ethnicity. The same issue applies to the names of towns and regions, which have changed over the years. You can play around with the spelling or explore different names for cities based on the time period. Please bear this in mind when trying to utilize these lists. Now, after all of that, we come to, of course, the big question. Why should I care? What can I learn from these things? And just like with American passenger lists, these passenger lists can provide a wealth of information, including, but not limited to, the names, gender, age, birth date, birthplace, occupation, residence, nationality, marital status, relationship to the head of the family, religion, military service, final place of destination, port of departure, date of departure, port of arrival, shipping line, accommodation, the ship name, etc. Now, this is a pretty wide amount of possible information. Please note that it will not be available for each entry. It can vary quite greatly with time. But think of them sort of as a flip side to arrival passenger lists. They often contain the same information, but can help fill in details that you may not be aware of. So let's actually take a look at some examples. So for this, I'll be looking at the regular passenger list. Now, I've already gone ahead and looked up a few names to keep in my back pocket to give you folks a general idea of, what ethnicities and what sort of information you can get from this by just pulling out some fairly random names. But let's just take a look here. All right, so Now, one other thing I want to mention about these lists, well, I guess two things really. One, as you can imagine, they are in German. Now, I know what you're thinking, Logan, I don't read German. Well, neither do I. Fortunately, though, with the aid of Google Translate, as well as just, diving into them, bureaucracy is fairly straightforward across national lines. You can start to figure things out. And one nice thing with the handout that I put together is that it's going to have a large number of very common German words that you'll find in these lists, along with translations. So the other thing I wanted to mention too is that these lists have been heavily checked by various scholars in Hamburg. So they tend to be a bit more accurate in terms of what, like the towns and the cities and trying to get that translation that can often be difficult when dealing with documents that are in cursive and another language. But so let's take a look here. All right, so I typed in Bronislaw Kowalski. So I need to find Kowalski in the surname. So we just go down here. Let's see here. I'm pretty sure it's where did I put in Bronislaw Kowalski? Yep. All right. So Bronislaw Kowalski, as you can see, as we go through here, that he's technically German. But if you look here, you'll see this this residence place, Plasowo. Now the name has changed over the years, but this is basically modern day Poland. These kinds of things allow us to figure out where people were. It can also give us greater ideas of what they did and understanding these sorts of patterns. Let's take a look at another one. All right, so this first one here, Zipperlieb. Now, some of the things that we can tell immediately. So from the name here, Zipra or Zipporah, depending on what language you're using, she's almost certainly going to be Jewish. As you can see here, though, she's listed as Austrian. Now, that might be kind of confusing because she's not German. But as we go down, this residence place, Zukoten, once you start looking it up, it turns out this is actually a small village in what is now today far western Ukraine. So, and that of course is well within the pale of settlement where large numbers of Jewish people would have lived at the time. So by using these sorts of things, we can start to figure it out. And the nice thing too is that you can often match them up with passenger lists here in America, particularly like the Ellis Island rolls, and just kind of see that interplay and learning some different things about your potential ancestors. So we're going to do one more. This one is a bit different. Okay, so this one right here, I was going through some of these lists to just kind of prepare. This one was very confusing to me. And this is just a good reminder to always check the actual document versus just taking ancestry, the details, as gospel truth. So Martin Quest and it seems like he's actually from Saratov. Now, that didn't make a lot of sense to me because that didn't really sound like a Russian name. And I was very confused. So you use some context clues. One, you actually take a look at the actual passenger list themselves. Let's see here. Right. And so I noticed some of the other names, right? Elsbeth, Karl, these are all German names. And once I realized that's actually a G, not a Q. Yes, which is a German name. And then you put that together with, say, this town. It's actually Saratov. Now, Saratov, unlike many of the towns and communities you'll see on here, is located deep in what is today present-day Russia. But what it turns out is that it was heavily settled by what is known as Volga Germans. This is a period that sees large amounts of them immigrating to the New World due to enforced Russification policies and other things that are very unpopular. So I think that you can kind of see what we're going for here in terms of what these lists have to offer. I would highly encourage all of you to take a look at it. And as I said before, for many people, if your ancestors do come from Central or Eastern Europe, there is an excellent chance of finding them in here. And even if they're not, they're a really interesting place to discover some unusual history and fascinating stories. That being said, that's basically what I have. So I would like to thank you all for attending today. And I think now we will move to questions.
Thank you so much. Do you want to go ahead and turn on your camera? I shall do the same. Hello. Thank you so much,
Oh,
Logan. That was fantastic.
my pleasure.
We have a lot of questions.
Oh, good.
Are you ready for them?
As ready as I'm going to be.
Okay. What was the catchment area that provided the passengers? How did the passengers get from those areas to Hamburg?
In terms of like from say like Poland or Ukraine to Hamburg?
Let's go with that.
Okay, in that case, railways. In fact, none of this is possible without the massive expansion of Europe's railway network, which I think roughly from like 1820 to 1880, for every mile of railway you have in 1820, you have 8 in 1880. Even in places as relatively undeveloped as Russia, trains are far and away like the movers of everything. So it's a relatively simple thing to get a railroad ticket if you can afford it. So they almost all arrive by railway.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there records of people who returned to Hamburg from the United States?
Yes, and sometimes you'll actually see that in the list themselves. I've seen a very large number of people after they've naturalized will actually go back as well. So you'll see, say someone is from Poland, right? They come to the United States, they become a naturalized citizen, they go back to Poland, say to visit family or whatever, and they leave to come back to the United States. You will occasionally see departure lists from Hamburg in that regard. And of course, many immigrants do return to the old country. Depending on the various ethnicity, you'll see higher rates of return. So for example, I think Romanians are actually the highest, like 1 out of 6 ends up like going back permanently to stay in the old country. It just depends, but yes, you will see that from time to time, especially if they've naturalized as Americans and are going back, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Where could I find out more about the Hamburg medical screening? Were records kept? And then my husband's great uncle was left behind in 1908 because of bad eyes, presumably trachoma, and I'm searching for more information on his fate.
Well, as far as I know, I do not believe any of the records were really kept. Even if they were it's honestly a minor miracle these were saved during World War II. They torched just about everything in Hamburg that they could. That being said, if you would like a more general understanding, I would suggest looking at the handout. A number of the books, particularly the Auspandora Holland Hamburg Immigration Port, which is number 1 on the list there, that will have like a really excellent, really detailed, complete with many photographs, not exactly timeline, but basically a walkthrough of what those medical examinations would consist of. And you have to remember, you're not getting just one, you're getting at least 2, because if you're going over to the border, the German police, while winking at what is basically illegal immigration, so long as you have that German steamship ticket, you're good though. They're sending you often to Leipzig or Dresden, where these very large centers are. And then if you pass that one, you go to Hamburg, where they delouse you, and they'll, if you're a man, they basically, shave you almost bald and all this sort of stuff, because they're not taking any chances.
Thank you. So I'm guessing maybe the same sources would be the answer for this, but in terms of collaboration between railroads and steamship companies, where can I find more information on that?
Well, I would suggest taking a look at a lot of these books. I will say they're like I was talking, the Auspandora Holland Hamburg Immigration Port is a particularly useful one. The other one I would recommend too, which I forgot to add to the handout, please forgive me, folks, is this book right here. This was actually published by the Bellin, which is a museum dedicated to Hamburg, America, and Albert Bellin in Hamburg. And it has a nice chapter. It has some nice, not an extensive understanding of like the connection with the railroads and the steamship lines, but enough to get you started. So I would highly recommend this book as well, Via Hamburg to the World.
Okay, I just put the link to the Amazon version in the chat.
Oh, fantastic.
Okay, so someone's wondering, are there records pre-1850?
No, they kept statistics, but my understanding is that they have not been published, at least not in English, and they're not available on Ancestry. They did keep those records from 1837 on, and unlike, say, the United States, which, passed laws, saying that ships had to keep passengerless and all these sorts of things, but didn't really stringently enforce it in a lot of ways, Hamburg does. But a lot of those records, the Staatsarchiv, the state's archives, they get full. And so the general attitude, to the horror of archivists and people everywhere, was just, well, no one's ever going to want to look at these. So they just took them and they tossed them, into the garbage. Bremen, the port that starts all of this, passenger list stuff in Germany, they take all of theirs until about 1880, and they just toss them in the trash as well, which would have been such an incredible gold mine for genealogists. And then, of course, the rest of them were incinerated in the various fire bombings of Germany during World War II. But yes, unfortunately, 1850 is largely the cutoff here.
Thank you. I like this question. How often were the surnames misspelled on the Hamburg lists?
So it's tough to say, because I would say, generally speaking, there is a pretty decent ratio of getting it right, because at the Auspandora Holland, they do employ translators that are familiar with these various languages. I don't think that you can underestimate how much of this is like, this company, these other companies, they're doing immigration the same way that Henry Ford is building cars at roughly the same time. This is big business. This is very streamlined. They definitely have a lot going for them. I will say that, considering the fact that you're dealing with roughly 3 different translators, you're dealing with the people who take down the names in the first place. You're dealing with the people in Hamburg years later, trying to index all of these things. And then you're adding the, 2 language jumps from, say, Polish, Yiddish, Finnish, Romanian, etc., to German and then to English, it's actually a pretty high proportion that they get pretty correct. So we'll say generally for a short answer.
Thank you. So I have found the passenger list for my ancestors from Hamburg to Liverpool, but
Mhm.
that is as far as I can find. Is there a way to find the second part of the passenger list?
Not really, because depending on the year, and almost certainly they're indirect passengers. So you found all that you're going to find on the Hamburg side. There probably isn't one for Liverpool because Great Britain did not mandate any kind of passenger lists until well past the vast, like the big wave of European immigration to the Americas in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, what I would recommend doing is if you have the information for, say, Liverpool, like the departure and everything, I would recommend starting to look through the American passenger lists and seeing if you can match it up to that, because that's your best bet.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Were passenger lists written in current script?
Current script in terms of,
The old German script.
oh, like the Gothic.
Yes,
It seems to depend on what years you're looking at. The earlier ones, yes, but as you get closer and closer to the modern day, it, it's more modern German, or modern enough for Google Translate to work for me anyway.
perfect. This person's family member immigrated to New York from Hamburg in 1891, found her on the Hamburg passenger list and also the New York passenger list. At what
Mhm.
point were each of these lists created and by whom?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. So basically, in Hamburg, they're created by the company, um, whichever company that is. Obviously, we talked a lot about Hamburg America because it was the biggest, but any of these various steamship companies in that took passengers on in Hamburg had to create these lists. Now they create two sets of lists, right? So one is constantly being updated as soon as the passengers get there, to the Auspandora Holland or just Hamburg in general, depending on where they're staying. And they're constantly updated until the very moment that the ship leaves. And then one set is going to go to the Staatsarchive. Archive. The other is going to remain with the captain of the ship. It's actually locked in his rooms. And in fact, one really nifty thing you can see as you go through these lists, you'll see lines through people. And that's people that, for whatever reason, canceled or could not go on that particular voyage. So some interesting what ifs in that regard. And then when you get to Ellis Island, they basically just take those lists and duplicate them in many respects. The old the old myth of like Ellis Island changing immigrants' names and stuff like that, they take them directly from these passenger lists that were created by Hamburg, or by the steamship companies, really, but mandated by the city state of Hamburg.
Thank you.
Mhm.
When did German ship records get recorded in Quebec? My ancestor left Hamburg and went to Quebec in 1857.
I am not sure. I will have to, if you would kindly send us an email and we'll see what we can turn up for you on that.
Okay, I did a quick search. It looks like there's Canada incoming passenger lists,
Mhm.
and they do have some from Quebec, and they do begin about 1865, and that's on Ancestry. I will put the link to that collection in the chat
Mhm.
just as a help, and that is for the personal subscription, not Ancestry Institution.
Mm.
Okay, so other than immigrants rejected by US authorities, did the ships carry any people or cargo back to Europe as a standard practice?
Yes. it's one of those things, it's important to remember for these steamship companies, it's all based around people movement. And like we talked about earlier, large amounts of immigrants will come back to the old country. Um, many of them, the goal is to work in America for wages that are low in America, but are high in Hungary or Romania or Poland, and then come back and be a big man in the village. So the goal is to constantly keep the ship holds full, because if they're not, they're wasting money. Many of these steamship companies originally, for example, they don't start out as people movers. That's just a sideline. In fact, so for example, Hauppauge, the packet part of it, they were carrying mail across the Atlantic. It's just slowly but surely over time, they started adding people. And so if you're making return voyages, yes. Of course, the thing is, though, as far as records go, Hamburg does not mandate that you have arrival passenger records. They're only really concerned with people going out, not people coming back in, so to speak. So sometimes you get lucky, though, and people go out, they come back, and they go out also through Hamburg. And I've seen that a number of times. So long story short, yes, because the goal is to make money.
Thank you. Did they most likely leave from their closest port? If not, what were their reasons for not?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I'm so glad you asked that. Because, Europe is full of ports, right? But so there's a couple reasons, though. One, different ports do different things. A port might be set up for trade. A port might be set up for fishing. A port might be set up for travel. One size does not fit all. You also have the issue too, where so many of these bigger immigration ports, Hamburg, Bremen, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Le Havre, and so on, and of course Liverpool, they've been doing this for decades. They have the infrastructure built, and of course with the addition of railways, this is not a nearly as big a journey as it would have been even 50 to 60 years before. And you add that into the fact that the vast majority of these immigrants that are coming through Hamburg, they're coming through the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And both of these empires, they make it illegal to immigrate. You can't go through most of these ports. Finland is a weird exception. Now, as time goes on, they will loosen these restrictions. Like, for example, the Kingdom of Hungary, which is functionally independent outside of Austria after 1867, except for foreign policy and stuff. They realize all these Hungarians are going through Bremen or Hamburg, and they're like, well, if they're going to leave anyway, we should get some of that money. So they make a deal with the Cunard line out of London to establish an immigration port at what is now the second biggest city in Croatia, but it's more widely known by its Italian name of Fiume. So it really just depends, but there's a lot of complicated historical, financial reasons why these folks go the way they go. So just to give you an example, say you're a Jewish family living in Poland. There's been a lot of riots in the area. The Russian government just announced its latest policy of great news. The Jewish people no longer have to pay special taxes, but you in turn will now be liable for conscription. And being conscripted into the Tsar's army is a 15 to 25-year commitment. And they want none of that. But you can't leave through St. Petersburg because immigration is illegal. So what you do is you bribe a border guard, you make sure you have a steamship ticket from a German company or something, and you just go across the border. The Germans direct you to Leipzig or Dresden, and you get on a boat. So it's this is why they go these different ways. Now, after World War I, this will change somewhat. As for example, the new Polish government will try to develop the ports of Stettin and Gdansk or Danzig, depending on who you talk to at the time. But even so, they don't want people leaving because they're trying to build all these new independent countries. But now I'm going off on a rant, but I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So we only have time for maybe one or two more. So let's go with this. Were the column headings on these documents somewhat standard over the years? And are there any translations available?
Well, wonderful. Yes, they are. And as translations go, if you actually look at the handout, outside of the various books that are listed, you're going to see a wide variety of common German words. And by that, I basically went through the column tops and translated all of them. So if you take a look at the handout, it should give you a breakdown of everything you're going to find in those columns and what they mean. And honestly, the more you play around with it, the more this is fairly standard. Like, to a certain extent, not exclusively, but you can almost take an American passenger list from, like, say, Ellis Island and 1907, and you can slap it on top of a Hamburg one from 1907, and they're basically the same. Some will have more information than others, just depending, but it's pretty standard is what I'm trying to get at. And please grab that free handout.
Thank you so much. Okay, we'll do one last question and that's it.
All right.
What kind of documentation did people provide?
Well, generally speaking, they didn't. You have to understand, this is it's very difficult, I think, for us in 2023 to understand just how little documentation people had at this time, particularly, if you're in the boonies of Poland or Ukraine or what have you. There's no birth certificates, there's no visas. You just show up and say your name. All the German government is concerned with is two things. Do you have a ticket, and that you're planning to leave? Because they don't want a bunch of Poles or Jewish people to set up shop. They want them out. But none of that matters. There's no real documentation here other than what people are saying. So there's a fair degree of trust in all of this. Now, later, of course, after World War I, when these barriers start coming up more and more, you'll get introduced to things like visas and things like that. There's a fair amount of just winking going on in all of this because, even so, for example, as I've said probably too many times at this point, with this immigration from these countries being illegal or at least heavily frowned on, folks are going to leave if they can. And so they're not particularly concerned about whether or not they're being scrupulously honest when they answer questions like, did you complete your term of military service for the Russian government? They're going to say yes. Give you another example. Roughly 50,000 Swiss will go through Hamburg. Switzerland tries to make people pay a huge gold deposit before leaving. How many Swiss do you think really wanted to leave a bunch of money sitting there they didn't. So there's a fair bit of winking going on here. The Hamburg and German authorities aren't stupid. These folks aren't dumb. They're leaving. In many cases, they know they're never coming back. So they're going to be fairly honest about things like where they're from, how old they are, and things of that nature. You can basically, accept as gospel, give or take. But just understand that, there is a level of just, aren't these institutional controls and assumptions that in many ways govern, most of our modern lives.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. So thank you, Logan, for an excellent presentation. And if we didn't get to your question, and I'm so sorry, there's 21 of them left, please email us. I will put the email in there. Again, we've been putting it in several times. Email us if you want a copy of the chat. Email us if you didn't get your question answered and you would like more information. We want to help you. And again, thank you, Logan, for a wonderful presentation. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day and see you guys on Thursday. Bye, everybody.
Take care, folks.